Welcome to part 3 of the third extra lecture for Problems of Philosophy. Now we're in the second part of the excerpt we have from the Republic. We're going to go to Plato trying to convince his interlocutor and us that philosophers or philosopher kings should be the ones to rule. Glaucon doesn't buy it. He says, look at any philosopher in the town square. They're too concerned with abstract things. They always have their heads in the clouds. And someone who's going to rule needs to be more practical. So Socrates builds up his argument. He has a bunch of extended metaphors. And we'll go through each of them. First one's the parable of the metals. The second is the ship parable, or parable of the ship. Third is the sun metaphor. The fourth is the divided line. And the fifth is Plato's cave. So throughout all this stuff, keep in the back of your mind that Socrates is trying to convince us that philosophers, or kings that are very philosophically minded, are the best suited to rule over states. Ask yourself what kinds of knowledge, skills, traits a good leader has, and see if Plato's arguments are convincing. First, the parable of the metals. He asks us to imagine that each of us have metal in our souls. This is saying that we have a fixed character. There's something that we're suited to. And the metaphor is that it's represented by metal in our souls. Bronze, silver, or gold. It's the foundation of our personalities. They tell us what kind of jobs we're suited to. So if you have a bronze soul, you're best suited to create goods or provide services. You're a laborer. Your particular mix of traits and abilities, strengths, make you click with this kind of role. If you have silver in your soul, you're best suited to be a guardian or a soldier. If you have gold, you're best suited to lead. Now, if you think about the way people have traditionally decided what they're going to do with their lives, up until very recently, it's parents that help their children to decide what role they should inhabit. They direct and they mold their children to do what they've done. So it's either explicit by training them. So if you're a farmer, then you train your child to be a farmer. If you're a metalsmith, you train your child to do the same. But you might also just do it implicitly or unconsciously because you can't help but share your own skills and abilities with your kids. But Plato wants parents to begin to recognize that that's not the way it should be. It shouldn't just be hereditary. People should be paired with the roles that they best fit in order to have a just society. The city and the state would be much more balanced if we didn't force people into the roles that weren't best for them. The parable of the ship is an allegory of democracy. Allegory. On a ship, on any ship, there's a crew and a captain. The crew might argue about who should steer the ship, how the ship should be steered. None of them know navigation. Some go further and say navigation can't even be learned. You just gotta have a talent for it. Even further, some might get angry and violent with those who suggest that navigation can even be learned. Some of them might beg and plead the captain or the others to be the driver of the ship. They might trick, they might manipulate, they might cozy up to the leader, they might mutiny, they might use violence. And this is the state of the world, Plato says, in democracy. If every single person with their varying temperament, skills, abilities, desires, if they all try and get to be the leader. You have all this stuff going on all the time in a democracy. But, Plato says, a good captain stares at the stars. He studies the winds and the seasons and it looks like he's focused on nothing but abstraction. But he's the only one that went to the trouble of getting the wisdom about navigation. So he's the only one that has knowledge about how to navigate the ship. So he is best suited as the person who looked for knowledge to steer the ship, not all the people with the other skills and abilities and desires. Next is the sun metaphor. So think about all of our senses: touch, taste, sight, hearing, smell. Sight is the only one that needs an intermediate thing in order to function. So when you touch anything or taste anything or smell anything, you're directly sensing. But when you look at something, you need light. That's the intermediate thing. So unless light is present, you can't use your power of sight to see. So light is not the identical thing to sight. It's not sight itself, but it is necessary in order for sight to occur. So the good is introduced here in the role of light. Without knowledge of the good itself, a person can't understand the world around them. Understand is the key word there. We all have the power to reason about things, to reason about our beliefs, our actions, our desires, but the good is the intermediate step in Plato's metaphor. It illuminates wisdom and truth. The good is to truth as light is to the power of sight. Okay, so we all have our ability to reason, but to get to truth, intelligible objects, we need the good as an intermediate, just like light is the intermediate to the power of sight. And the good is just, well, let's start with this first. All intelligible objects are, for our purposes, are pieces of wisdom. That's what intelligible objects are. It's only accessible through reasoning, a very specific form of reasoning as well. Philosophical dialogue aimed at understanding how the world fits together. So you're seeking laws, you're seeking regularities, and these laws and regularities govern the way the world works. So we try to get to truth, which are these laws and these regularities, by philosophical questioning and dialogue. And the good is a form that's out there that guides us to find this truth. Hopefully it'll become a little bit clearer when we look at this metaphor. You see that there's a picture over here on the right, the divided line, a picture of Plato's ontology. So remember, ontology just means the way the world is or is structured. And you see world of images down at the bottom. So these are things that aren't as solid as the world of objects, which we'll look at in a minute. They're things that depend on the power of imagination. Shadows, reflections, art, fictions, fictional creatures. They're images in our real world. As you go from the bottom to the top, you're going from less reality to more reality in Plato's idea of the way the world works. So our imagination is the least real. The next category is the world of objects. So everything we interact with on a daily basis: tables, dogs, trees, cars, every solid object that's around us. And then that second line divides the physical world from the world of the mind. And those are the things that are intelligible alone. So you sense things that are in the world of objects and in the world of images. You use your senses. But in the mind, you only use your reason. So the first section in the intelligible world is using your intellect to understand math or shapes or universals, so categories. But the highest reality of being or goodness is the thing that is the most real. It's the universal form of everything. This is everything that's in the world. The bottom two sections, like I said, are the world of the senses, our ordinary world, knowledge and true wisdom are the things that reside in the world of the intelligible. So even if you don't understand what the good is, it doesn't matter so much for our purposes, as long as you understand that knowledge is only accessible by the mind. Think about it like this. When you learn a formula in science class, so E equals mc squared, or force equals mass times acceleration, or if you learn about what governments are and the forms they typically take in a political science or a history class, or you learn about the elements in chemistry, you're learning the underlying rules about how things work. And this is only accessible to reason. That's why it's only intelligible. You can't see these rules out in the world. You can't sense them. You can't touch, taste, or smell them. The knowledge, the wisdom, comes from the abstracting that the mind does. And that's the key point. It doesn't really matter what the good is, as long as you get that. Because the only people that get this kind of knowledge, according to Plato, are philosophers. Okay, so this is maybe the most famous metaphor that Plato has, Plato's cave. So he asks you to imagine that you're chained in a deep cave. You can't move your head or your body. You can only stare straight ahead. So your whole body's chained. Your head is chained in place. You can't even move it left, right. You can't see yourself. And you see a play of images in front of you on the cave wall, just like if you were watching a movie. And if you've been there for your entire life, you would think that the movie was all there was to reality. There was nothing more. But then imagine yourself breaking free and looking around. You'd see that the images that you were watching aren't real, that they were being projected from behind you. And you've been confined for so long, and this is all so new. So this process is really painful, emotionally and physically. You see an impossibly bright light, something brighter than you've ever seen before, and that's the cave entrance. So you start to climb toward it, and the pain gets worse, but you continue on into the sunlight. Now you're in the real world, and you see reality for the first time. So this metaphor, of course, is people who stay down in the cave, or the people who are only sensing. They think of objects as the most real, but it's knowledge that they're missing. And when you climb out of the cave, you're getting to the world of the mind, where you can get this knowledge or wisdom. Then Plato says, okay, well, imagine what would happen if you went back down into the cave and you tried to convince the others who were still chained up about what you'd seen. And Plato contends that they despise you, they disbelieve you, they'd call you arrogant, they might even tear you from limb from limb, is what they say. So why would you ever go back down there? You'd want to stay in the world of the truth. So those who are stuck at the bottom, they're at the bottom of the divided line too. No access to wisdom, knowledge, or truth. So only the people who go through the painful process of investigating the world through philosophical methods can get this access. So remember that truth and wisdom is only graspable by the mind. That's the intelligible. The philosophers won't want to rule. They'll want to stay in the real world. They don't want to be ridiculed, but they have to be convinced to come down and order society because they're the only ones that could see the rules or the formulas about the way things work. They're the only ones that have wisdom about justice. They know how things ought to be run. And a corollary to this is that we should only choose people to rule who don't want to rule. So a balanced society is a just society. And only philosopher kings can create and maintain this balance and this justice because of the wisdom that they have to impart. Okay, so our final slide is comparisons between Rawls and Plato. So, of course, Plato might seem really far removed from the sophistication of Rawls's contemporary notions of what justice is or should be. But the way he orders society does point to an issue with Rawls and his egalitarian liberalism. So Rawls emphasizes individual self-interest as the underlying principle of all just societies. When we're rational, Rawls says, in a truly equal way. So that means we're in the original position. We're all equal if we're stripped of our identifying markers. We will choose the organizing principles of a society in a way that's fair to everyone. But many people think this is lacking because it has no place for interdependence, for civic virtue, and for cooperative motives and emotions. Whatever else Plato's lacking, he acknowledges that civil society has to concentrate on how people interact with one another as fundamental. It has to create a mutually self-interested society where the bonds between individuals disappear. We might not be able to eliminate virtue and morality from the way we set up the structure of our societies, like Rawls advocates. Plato's formal scheme of balanced souls is also pretty far away from what we consider virtuous today, but there are overlaps. People working together for a robust civic life, which means things like quality education, good caretaking of the environment, access to health care, public transportation, having art and culture available to everyone. If you want this kind of robust civic life, you need solidarity and interconnectedness in the citizens, a common goal to drive toward instead of everyone just out for themselves, like the rationally self-interested individual in all classical liberal policy. So that's the end of the third and final extra lecture. As always, email me if you have questions.